The Bitterroot Valley was a kingdom carved from ice, ruled by a man whose heart was colder than the mountain winds. When the blinding whiteout descended, the ruthless ranch owner made a fatal calculation, cast the heavily pregnant mare out into the blizzard, saving resources meant for the deserving. It was a calculated death sentence, yet the elements that sought to destroy life sometimes forged something stronger. Against all natural law, a creature survived the night, a foal born under the unforgiving weight of the storm. Forged in absolute cold, this impossible spirit became an unnatural force, rising to defy the tyrant's authority and shatter the hard, cynical silence of the valley forever. The wind was a living thing, a biting, relentless spirit tearing through the Bitterroot Valley. It did not merely howl. It grated, sounding like stone grinding against stone, a sound that had been the background score to Caleb Thorne's reign for decades. Caleb Thorne, 54, stood before the immense bay window of his Iron Crest Ranch office. His broad shoulders were rigid beneath tailored wool, and his weathered face was set in an expression of perpetual, cold calculation. His blue eyes, usually sharp and invasive, were currently focused on the churning sky, assessing the cost. It was December 2013, and the decennial whiteout, the worst blizzard in memory, was swallowing the valley whole. Thorne pulled his attention back to the massive, leather-bound ledger of liabilities resting on his mahogany desk. This book was the gospel of his operation, detailing every expense, every profit margin, every life worth keeping. He ran a thick finger down a column dedicated to the breeding stock. His gaze stopped on the entry for an aging mare. Willow, he muttered, the name devoid of warmth. Willow, the aging mare, was a liability. Heavily pregnant, her movement dull and heavy, she was costing him feed and shelter she wouldn't earn back for months, maybe never. Her last 2 foals had been average. In the face of the encroaching whiteout, she was a resource sink. Thorne prided himself on absolute efficiency. There was no room for sentimentality, especially when resources were finite and the coming storm demanded triage. The cruel equation was simple. Eliminating her now saved resources for the stronger stock, ensuring the overall efficiency of Iron Crest Ranch remained absolute. He called for his foreman, his voice cutting through the thick silence of the office like cracked ice. Minutes later, Dalton Hayes, 31, entered, already wearing the deep fatigue that settled upon any man who worked beneath Thorne. Dalton, lean of build and observant with tired brown eyes, had spent his life jaded by the rancher's tyranny, harboring a suppressed resentment that he never dared vocalize. "Hayes," Thorne stated, tapping the ledger of liabilities. "Willow. She's due too close to the storm. She won't survive, and Shell just consumed the emergency feed. We lose her in the calving barn. We lose space, time, and attention we need for the valuable stock." Dalton understood the unspoken command. In Thorne's world, a guaranteed loss was better than a potential inefficiency. "Sir, the snow is already hitting drifts 5 feet deep out by the perimeter fence. She's heavy. She won't make it to the lower pasture." Thorne did not acknowledge the humane plea. "She's not going to the lower pasture. She's going out Sentinel Gorge. Her destiny is already written on this page. Do it now, before the wind seals the gate shut." The brutal simplicity of the order chilled Dalton deeper than the temperature outside. It wasn't merely disposal. It was a cold, calculated murder, justified by the ledger. Dalton nodded, his usual pragmatic facade cracking just slightly under the weight of his suppressed resentment. The expulsion was brutal. Willow, heavily pregnant and slow, fought the harness, her thick winter coat already frosted with fresh snow. The air was a thick, blinding soup of ice crystals. The decennial whiteout was fully upon them, reducing the sprawling, imposing architecture of Iron Crest Ranch, a symbol of Thorne's rigid control and wealth, to a ghost in the swirling chaos. Dalton, mounted on a strong workhorse, kept his head down, pushing Willow relentlessly toward the eastern boundary. Every painful, labored step Willow took was a fresh indictment of Thorne's soulless management. The mare was exhausted, but deep in her dull, heavy movements resided an almost desperate maternal instinct, a resilience that only life fighting for life could generate. They reached the edge of Sentinel Gorge, remote pasture land, exposed to the harshest elements. It was a place where nothing survived long in the best of times, a windswept, isolated ravine. "Go on, get," Dalton yelled, forcing her through a small, unsecured gate. He slapped her flank one last time, a gesture that was half cruelty, half apology. Willow stumbled forward, swallowed immediately by the wall of white. Dalton didn't wait to see her fall. He couldn't. He spurred his horse back toward the temporary safety of the barn, leaving the mare to her certain fate, the sound of the wind screaming Thorn's judgment over the land. The night that followed was an impossibility. Willow pushed deeper into Sentinel Gorge, driven not by direction but by the sheer primal need to escape the punishing wind. The snow was a physical enemy, stealing breath and warmth. Her strength ebbed, but the internal clock, the relentless pressure of the life she carried, kept her stumbling onward. She found a slight natural overhang, shielded minimally from the direct fury of the gale, and collapsed. The world was silence and cold, broken only by the excruciating labor. The birth at Sentinel Gorge occurred under the merciless blanket of snow. Willow, utilizing her last reserves of ferocious, maternal energy, cleaned the newborn. The blizzard colt, which would later be named Ash by the valley's locals, was an immediate anomaly. It was not weak, not sickly. It rose almost instantly, fueled by a terrifying, impossible resilience. Its coat was dark, shifting, catching the minimal light strangely, almost like obsidian dusted with fresh snow. It stood on legs that were unnaturally fast and strong, already braced against the earth that had intended to consume it. The mare, spent, watched her foal for an hour, a silent testament to defiance against the calculated death sentence. As the storm began to recede just before dawn, Willow's final breath feathered into the frigid air. The blizzard colt, Ash, did not mourn in the human sense. It absorbed the cold, the silence, and the resilience of its mother's final act. Then, powered by a life force that defied every law of nature and probability, it moved away from the frozen body, disappearing into the pale morning light, a creature forged by the very elements meant to destroy it. Days later, when the valley began to dig itself out of the wreckage, Dalton Hayes could not shake the image of the mare being driven out. Guilt, suppressed for years by the necessity of survival under Thorn, drove him back to Sentinel Gorge. He expected to find 2 frozen casualties, justifying Thorn's ruthless efficiency. What he found instead was unnerving silence, and then evidence of the impossible. There was Willow, frozen solid, yet positioned as if protecting something. And then there were the tracks, the ice-forged hoofprints, deep, distinct, and spaced widely apart, indicating immense speed and power. They were unlike the prints of any domestic horse. They seemed to have pressed into the frozen ground with supernatural strength, the ice around the edges fractured and distinct. Dalton knelt, running his gloved hand over the proof. A foal, a newborn, should have been immediately claimed by the cold, yet these prints indicated a creature not merely surviving, but mastering the environment. They tracked away, strong and true, into the vast, untouched wilderness. Dalton returned to Ironcrest Ranch, his jaw tight. He did not report his findings. What was there to report? That the storm had gifted the valley a ghost. January 2014 transitioned into a frigid February, and then a muddy March. The talk started small, hushed whispers exchanged around the wood stove at the Crossroads Bar and Mercantile, the local town hub where ranch hands and local residents gathered. A rancher from the North Fork claimed to have seen a foal, dark, faster than anything he'd ever chased, outrunning coyotes in the deep snow. A traveler swore he saw a creature that moved like smoke across the high ridge tops, its coat shimmering in the weak winter sun, appearing and vanishing in the same breath. The story coalesced around the dark foal born during the decennial whiteout. It was too fast, too strong, too elusive. They began to call it Ash, the blizzard colt. It wasn't just a horse, it was becoming a symbol of fierce, impossible resilience. Caleb Thorne dismissed the talk as winter superstition, the delirium brought on by cabin fever and cheap whiskey. He was focused on his spring lambing and the preparation for the yearly branding. His authority was absolute, symbolized by the heavy, distinctive CT branding iron, the tool of ranch ownership he used to mark every beast that dared to breathe on his land. But the sightings became frequent, moving closer to the heart of the valley, always near Ironcrest Ranch. The blizzard colt was maturing at an unnatural pace. By early summer 2014, Ash was no longer a foal. It was a young stallion, lean and powerfully muscled, a shadow running the boundary lines. Its uncanny speed and supernatural connection to the wild landscape were undeniable. It knew every hidden pass, every icy stream, every weakness in Thorn's fences. Dalton Hayes saw Ash one twilight, grazing on the far hill overlooking the main compound. The colt lifted its head, its dark eyes meeting Dalton's across the pasture. Dalton felt not fear, but a strange deep surge of recognition, the resilience he had suppressed for years, reflected in that untamable gaze. Ash was defiance given flesh. The conflict escalated from sightings to direct interference. Ash began disrupting Iron Crest operations with a cunning and precision that seemed impossible for a wild horse. He would appear suddenly during roundups, cutting off Thorne's best herd horses, spooking cattle, and leading Thorne's valuable stock toward unbranded wilderness pastures. It wasn't random, it felt strategic, a direct challenge to the rancher's absolute authority. Thorne, now infuriated, finally understood that the creature was not a ghost, but a physical threat to his control. He had been ridiculed in whispers at the Crossroads Bar and Mercantile. His reputation as the iron-willed proprietor was being chipped away by a horse that should have frozen to death before Christmas. That animal is unbranded. It belongs to no one. That means it belongs to me or it belongs to the grave, Thorne roared, slamming his fist onto his desk. It is a weakness in my system, Hayes. Find it. Bring it in. If it can't be broken, it will be put down. Thorne commissioned a massive 3-day hunt across the Bitterroot Valley. This was not about cattle anymore. It was about authority. The fate of the valley hung on which spirit would prevail, the rigid demands of cruel men or the wild spirit born in the darkest of nights. The chase culminated on a scorching July afternoon near the northern section of Iron Crest, where the valley floor began its sharp ascent into the mountains. Thorne, personally leading the charge on his fastest thoroughbred, was consumed by a blinding rage. He had spotted Ash cutting a path through the tall golden grasses, moving with that impossible speed, a streak of dark defiance against the pale sky. Dalton, Hayes, and 2 other ranch hands were spread out, trying to box the colt in, but Ash moved with foresight. It anticipated every cut, every turn, utilizing the terrain with the wisdom of an ancient spirit. Thorne carried the heavy, distinctive CT branding iron, heated slightly, and wrapped in thick cloth, a symbolic act he intended to perform immediately upon capture, staking his claim decisively or use as a deterrent for disposal. The climax arrived in a wide, sweeping basin. Thorne managed to push Ash toward a narrow, rocky choke point. He spurred his thoroughbred to an insane gallop, closing the distance. "Mine!" Thorne yelled, his voice rough and primal, echoing his tyrannical claim over every living thing in the valley. Ash was running at full tilt, yet its movements were fluid, effortless. As Thorne drew within roping distance, the impossible happened. Ash didn't continue straight into the trap. Instead, it executed a maneuver that defied physics. In a single, powerful burst of momentum, it angled sharply, running parallel to Thorne's horse for a moment, an unnerving closeness. Thorne hurled the rope. It missed by inches. Then Ash accelerated again, not away, but directly into the midst of a small, separate herd of Thorne's most valuable, skittish broodmares. The colt did not kick or bite. It simply moved through them like a disruptive force field. The energy of its untamed speed, the sheer wildness of its presence, instantly turned the calm herd into a panicked, stampeding torrent. The chaos was instantaneous. Thorne's thoroughbred, caught in the rush, was spun violently. Thorne fought to maintain control, the rope slipping from his grasp. The sight of Ash moving through the panic with perfect predatory calm humiliated him. Ash cleared the stampede, then stopped impossibly just 20 yards from the flustered, raging rancher. The colt turned, looking directly at Caleb Thorne. Its shifting, dark coat seemed to absorb the summer sun, making it look like a silhouette carved from the night itself. Thorne, dismounting to regain his balance, stood panting, clutching the wrapped branding iron. He felt the cold shock of true helplessness. The horse wasn't just fast. It was untouchable. It was mocking the very idea of ownership. In a final, profound act of defiance, Ash pawed the earth once, twice deeply. These were not nervous scrapes. They were deliberate marks. When Ash turned and vanished into the high rocks, disappearing as effortlessly as it had appeared, Thorne was left staring at the ground. There, etched into the baked earth, were 2 perfect, deep, ice-forged hoof prints, impossibly clear reminders of its birth in the freezing wilderness, right at the feet of the man who had cast it out. The branding iron felt heavy and useless in Thorne's hand. He had the tool of ownership, but the subject of his desire was unclaimable. Ash had openly challenged his authority and won, not through force but through sheer impossible nature. The failure of the great hunt was immediately known throughout the valley. Thorn returned to Iron Crest, defeated not by an enemy with weapons, but by an uncontrollable force of nature, a creature he himself had created in his hubris. The whispers at the Crossroads Bar and Mercantile ceased to be whispers. They became declarations. The sight of Ash, the blizzard colt, became not a superstition, but an inspiration. The oppressive weight of Thorn's tyranny, that cold and cynical heart of the Bitterroot Valley, began to crack. If a heavily pregnant mare, condemned by a man's cruel calculation, could produce a being that defied death and openly mocked the ruler of the valley, what else was possible? The ranch hands, long oppressed by Thorn's dominance, started small rebellions. Tools went missing. Fences were mended slowly. The rigid efficiency that defined Ironcrest Ranch began to erode. Dalton Hayes, standing outside the barn that evening, finally made a choice. He walked into the foreman's office, dropped his ranch keys onto the desk, and walked away. The jaded pragmatic was gone, replaced by a quiet, resolved hope. He left Ironcrest Ranch and walked toward the mountains, toward the wild spaces where Ash ran free, choosing the untamed future over the shackled past. Caleb Thorne watched the valley shift around him. He continued to manage Ironcrest with iron efficiency, checking his ledger of liabilities daily, but the numbers no longer held the same absolute truth. The boundaries of his control were shrinking, constrained by the memory of the deep hoofprints left near his feet. The blizzard colt Ash never returned to the confines of domestication. It became a living legend, a permanent sentinel of the Bitterroot Valley. Its dark, shifting coat was a constant shimmering reminder across the ridges, a signal that the valley's relationship with power had fundamentally changed. The fate of the Bitterroot Valley, once dictated by the rigid demands of cruel men, was now inextricably linked to the wild spirit born in the darkest of nights, signaling an end to the old ways forever. The cold, cynical heart of the region had thawed, replaced by resilience forged in ice. Thorne was left alone with his tools, his empire intact in name only, a ghost of the absolute authority he once commanded. The keys to the foreman's office lay silent on the scarred mahogany desk, reflecting the single bare bulb hanging overhead. Dalton had left them precisely in the center, a miniature act of rebellion that spoke volumes in the echoing, sterile halls of Ironcrest Ranch. Caleb found them the next morning. He didn't shout. Shouting required acknowledgement of failure, and in Caleb's world, there was no room for operational failure, only unforeseen costs. He picked up the keys, their familiar weight suddenly foreign, then placed them carefully in a drawer. Dalton's departure, following the humiliation of the great hunt, was not just the loss of a foreman, it was the first fissure in the dam of Caleb's absolute authority. The valley had seen its ruler stumble, beaten not by a competitor, but by the phantom of his own cruelty. Caleb returned to his routine, a rigid, unbending structure that had always been his sanctuary. He reviewed the ledger of liabilities, detailing the costs of the failed hunt, assigning a specific dollar amount to every wasted man-hour, every length of severed fence wire. He tried to find Ash within its pages, a clear numerical entry, a defined loss, an identifiable problem. But the colt remained outside the realm of calculation, an impossible variable. The remaining ranch hands moved with a new slowness, a palpable lack of urgency that defied the iron efficiency Caleb demanded. The cattle drives were executed with sluggish precision. Fences sagged for an extra day before repair. The great sprawling Ironcrest Ranch, once a humming engine of productivity, now resonated with a dull, reluctant drag. Caleb watched them, his cold blue eyes cataloguing every fractional deviation from the established standards, but he could no longer afford to fire them all. He was hostage to his own empire, dependent on the loyalty he had systematically crushed out of existence. His frustration settled into a corrosive obsession. He spent hours polishing the branding iron, the heavy, distinctive CT tool of ranch ownership. It was a ritualistic act. He would feel the cold steel against his palm, recalling the heat, the smell of burnt hide, the declaration of possession. Every line, every animal, every resource in the Bitterroot Valley was supposed to bear this mark, yet Ash ran free, unbranded, a living, breathing rejection of that very authority. He began driving out daily, sometimes alone, toward the high ridges and the outer boundaries, scanning the distances with powerful binoculars. He wasn't looking for Ash to capture it anymore. He was looking for a sign of weakness, a limp, a sickness, proof that nature, and therefore his own judgment, had been correct, and that the impossible resilience was just a fleeting illusion. He wanted the natural order of things to reclaim the defiance, but Ash was always perfection. By late summer 2014, the cult was magnificent, a dark, sleek silhouette of untamed power. Its sightings were now public events, shared not in whispers but in defiant observations. Ash often appeared on ridges overlooking the ranch, standing motionless against the western sun, a dark sentinel. It wasn't harassment, it was presence. The true seismic shift was occurring not at Ironcrest, but among the people. The Crossroads Bar and Mercantile, once a place for resigned grumbling, became a cradle of quiet insurrection. The tale of Willow's impossible survival, the memory of her fierce maternal resilience against the blizzard, fueled a strange courage. They saw in Ash the proof that Caleb's calculated pronouncements were not destiny. One crisp autumn evening, a group of smaller landowners, perpetually squeezed and manipulated by Caleb's vast economic power, gathered in the back room of the Mercantile. They weren't discussing cattle prices. They were discussing land usage, shared water rights, and the collective memory of injustice. "He said my spring lambs wouldn't survive the whiteout," muttered an old woman named Martha, stirring her coffee. Caleb said it was inevitable, and yet Willow's colt survived a sentence of death birthed in ice. Her neighbor, a wiry man named Ben, nodded. "It's the mark, isn't it? Every animal we own, every acre we work, carries his mark. But Ash carries the mark of the ice, unclaimable." The ice-forged hoofprints had become the valley's new iconography. People spoke of finding them near dried creek beds or on windswept granite, deep and distinct. Even months after the thaw, they weren't merely tracks, they were signatures of freedom, pressed into the very foundation of the land Caleb claimed to own. Dalton, having found work helping a small independent logging crew further up the valley, occasionally visited the crossroads. He was leaner now, the perpetual fatigue replaced by a guarded energy. He never spoke of his time at Ironcrest, but he listened. He observed the change in the valley's spine, the way men stood taller, the way they met Caleb's rare appearances in town with silence, not deference. Dalton knew the truth that fueled their hope. He had driven Willow out, sealing her fate, yet he had seen the impossible tracks leading away from the body. He had seen the raw, terrible beauty of a life that refused to be managed by a ledger. That knowledge was his new burden, a moral compass pointing north toward the untamed wildness. Caleb sensed the shift, recognizing the decay of his social capital. The tyranny had relied not just on wealth, but on the silent, internalized acceptance of his authority. Now, that acceptance was dissolving, replaced by an invisible, communal resistance. He needed to re-establish dominance, to prove that his laws superseded the chaotic freedom of nature. He focused on the upcoming annual November cattle auction, a key date where the regional market gathered, and where Ironcrest Ranch traditionally displayed its economic muscle and superior breeding stock. This year, it would serve as his stage. The plan was simple, if deeply symbolic. He would use his highest value stock, a carefully bred herd of white-faced Herefords, pure and heavy, representing the pinnacle of calculated investment and management. He would drive them through the valley center, a parade of ownership, and then sell them at a premium, reinforcing the inviolable rule calculation and control win. But the valley had learned to wait for Ash. The day of the auction drive arrived, cold and clear. Caleb, mounted on a powerful bay, positioned himself at the head of the Hereford herd. He wore his finest riding gear, radiating the cold, imposing presence of absolute authority. The drive began perfectly, the heavy cattle moving with the practiced obedience instilled by years of rigid ranching. As they reached the wide central plain, where the valley road met the main highway leading to the auction pens, the air changed. The noise of the cattle, the jingle of harnesses, the occasional shout of a ranch hand all seemed suddenly muted. A hush fell over the small crowd of onlookers who had gathered by the roadside, including many of the small ranch owners and Dalton, watching from a distance near the edge of a stand of aspen. Ash appeared, not rushing, not spooking, but walking out of the sparse, frost-tipped woods onto the plain, moving parallel to the main drive. The blizzard colt, now fully matured into a young stallion, was breathtakingly powerful. His dark, shifting coat seemed to drink the light, making him appear both perfectly defined and subtly unreal. He moved with a devastating economy of effort, every muscle perfectly tuned to the environment. Caleb saw him instantly. The rage, suppressed and polished over the last few months, erupted, blinding and suffocating. "Hayes is gone. You won't save him, you beast!" Caleb screamed, pulling his sidearm from its holster, the sound shattering the quiet. He didn't fire, he pointed, a desperate threat aimed at a force he could not comprehend. Ash didn't flinch. He walked closer, his presence drawing every eye, including those of the high-value Hereford herd. The horses Caleb's men were riding grew nervous, sidestepping and blowing. This was the true final confrontation, not a physical chase but a battle for symbolic legitimacy, the highly managed expensive stock versus the impossible free spirit. Ash stopped 50 yards from the nearest Hereford, then lifted his head and issued a sound that was pure wilderness. It was not a roar nor a neigh but a deep, resonant challenge, forged in the solitude of the Sentinel Gorge. The response was immediate and terrifyingly complete. The nearest Hereford cow, a huge placid animal that had never known a moment outside of strict domestication, lifted her head. She looked at Ash, then at Caleb, and then she moved. She walked out of the drive, not bolted, not panicked, but deliberately walked toward the dark stallion. And then another followed, and another. The rigid control of the drive disintegrated. The Herefords, bred for docility and meat, began to drift, drawn by the untamed call. Caleb watched his assets, his calculation incarnate, abandoning the very road that led to their valuation. They were not running from him. They were walking toward Ash. The herd fractured, an irreparable split between the domesticated destiny offered by Ironcrest and the unknown freedom represented by the dark colt. Caleb fired a shot into the air, a desperate attempt to break the spell. The sound only served to push the cattle faster toward the wilderness. Ash watched Caleb's agonizing display of helplessness. Then, in a final, profound declaration, Ash turned, leading the dissenting fraction of the Herefords not into the mountains, but along the boundary line of Ironcrest Ranch, toward the open, unbranded territory. He was not stealing them. He was showing them the choice. Caleb stood in the dust, surrounded by the remaining confused cattle and his demoralized ranch hands. The planned parade of efficiency had become a public spectacle of failure. The community gathered along the roadside watched, silent witnesses to the moment the iron grip broke. Dalton, standing among the aspens, felt a surge of exhilaration he hadn't known since before he started working for Caleb. The ledger of liabilities could account for lost feed, for sick animals, for market fluctuations, but it could never account for the collective refusal of life to be owned. Caleb, abandoning the drive entirely, rode back to the Ironcrest gates. He dismounted heavily, the weight of the branding iron still strapped uselessly to his saddle, pressing down on him. He grabbed the tool and carried it into his office. He found the ledger of liabilities open on his desk. He looked at the endless columns of data, the meticulous records of profit and loss, of control exerted and resources maximized. He took the branding iron, the heavy, cold symbol of his dominance, and brought it down hard upon the pages of the ledger. Once, twice, the steel edge tore through the leather and paper, rendering the meticulous records illegible. He wasn't destroying the book out of spite. He was recognizing that the math no longer mattered. The efficiency was broken. The control was an illusion. The valley no longer believed in the authority dictated by cost management. Caleb sat back, the room silent save for his own ragged breathing. He had the ranch, the acreage, the remaining cattle, but the soul of the Bitterroot Valley was gone, liberated by the impossible spirit he had cast out into the decennial whiteout. The rest of the winter was quiet. The legend of Ash solidified into truth. The Blizzard Colt became a benchmark. When Caleb tried to raise land rents, the small farmers refused, finding strength in their collective defiance. When he demanded preferential access to water, the irrigation districts stood firm. The tyranny had become brittle, snapping under the persistent pressure of collective, Ash-inspired courage. Caleb continued to exist at Ironcrest, a proprietor ruling over an increasingly autonomous territory. His blue eyes, once cold and imposing, now carried a perpetual shadow of confusion, the confusion of a man whose absolute law had been overturned by a creature of wild chance. He never again attempted to capture Ash, recognizing the futility of trying to brand the wind. The Bitterroot Valley, once defined by the harsh cynicism of men like Caleb, slowly began to change its character. The coldness did not vanish overnight, but beneath the snow and the hard earth, a seed of fierce resilience had been planted. People saw ash, sometimes miles away, moving across the peaks, a dark promise that life, even when driven out and condemned, could defy the calculus of cruelty. The ice-forged hoofprints occasionally appeared in the spring thaw, not just in the wilderness, but sometimes near the roads, close enough for anyone to see. They were deep and true, marks of a creature born from the impossible cold, signifying a fundamental, permanent shift in the relationship between man and land. The old ways, governed by the rigid mathematical demands of cruel men, were over. The Bitterroot Valley had found its true untamable spirit, forged in the darkness of the greatest storm, signaling freedom forever. Caleb remained, a statue of obsolete authority, watching his empire managed, not by his ledger, but by the shadow of the blizzard colt. The autumn passed into a winter that felt different from all the Bitterroot winters before. The cold was still a physical weight, crushing and deep, but the air carried a faint, almost imperceptible lightness, a sense of having shed a terrible burden. At Iron Crest, Caleb Thorne's house was increasingly dark. He moved through the sprawling mansion like a ghost, haunting his own legacy. The destruction of the ledger of liabilities had been a desperate act of confession, a recognition that the universe he had built on figures and cost analysis was mathematically flawed when faced with the absolute zero of defiance. He no longer went to the office. The detailed, meticulous demands of ranch management, once the core of his identity, now felt profoundly pointless. The remaining hands, those who stayed only because the valley offered few other sources of income, operated on minimal effort. They were paid, fed, and housed, but the fear that had once driven their productivity had evaporated. The efficiency of Iron Crest Ranch, the benchmark of its greatness, bled away like snowmelt. Fences went unrepaired for weeks, not days. Machinery sat idle, waiting for parts that Caleb was too detached to order. The ranch became a monument to stagnation, a grand, imposing ruin still technically functional, but spiritually dead. Caleb still possessed the branding iron. He kept it on the mantelpiece above the great stone fireplace, not as a tool, but as a silent obsidian piece of sculpture. Sometimes he would stare at it, remembering the heat, the satisfying sound of ownership being seared into flesh. Now it was cold. It carried no weight. He realized that the brand had never truly symbolized ownership. It had symbolized control, and control was merely a fragile illusion, easily shattered by the sight of one dark, unbranded colt running free. His rage, once focused and sharp, became diffuse, settling into a cold, paralyzing bitterness. He stopped driving out to the ridges to look for Ash. He knew where Ash was, everywhere. The blizzard colt, having forced the fracture during the cattle drive, had settled into the role of the Bitterroot's silent patron. Ash was not just surviving, he was thriving, leading a small, growing band of wild horses, augmented by the defected Herefords, deep into the high country. The story that circulated at the crossroads was that the formerly branded cattle now running with Ash were growing thicker coats, their movements sharper, their instinct for the wild returning with unnatural speed. They were undomesticating themselves, reversing the generations of calculated breeding that Iron Crest represented. Dalton, now working exclusively with the independent crews, watched these changes with sober understanding. He didn't celebrate Caleb's downfall. He recognized it as the inevitable consequence of absolute inhumanity. He focused on building infrastructure for the small community, reinforcing shared irrigation ditches, assisting with barn repairs, organizing small cooperative cattle sales that bypassed Iron Crest's traditional chokehold on the market. The collective will, inspired by Ash, had solidified into economic reality. Martha, Ben, and a dozen other small owners formed the Iceforge Co-op, deliberately choosing a name that invoked the origin of their freedom. They pooled resources, shared information, and established direct trading routes to regional markets that had previously been inaccessible due to Caleb's manipulation of transport costs. "He thought everything had a price tag, didn't he, Dalton?" Martha asked one evening at the mercantile, her eyes clear and sharp. "He thought life was a liability to be managed. But Ash taught us that resilience doesn't count for profit. Resilience is free." Dalton nodded, stirring his coffee. He never understood the land, only the property deed. The deed doesn't feed the cattle when the blizzard hits. The winter of 2014-2015 was predicted to be exceptionally long and brutal, a fitting challenge for the valley's newfound independence. As December approached, the first truly heavy snows began to fall, early and thick. This was the critical time when the small ranchers needed to move their breeding stock and remaining young cattle down from the high exposed pastures to the sheltered lower grazing land near the valley floor. There was one path, however, crucial for the safe descent of the herds, a narrow sheltered pass called the Winter Shelf, which ran along the northern border of Ironcrest Ranch before descending into the common grazing fields. This path historically belonged to Ironcrest according to the original archaic property lines, though Caleb had never enforced the right-of-way, finding the lower valley more efficient for his operations. This year, Caleb remembered the path. Stripped of his financial weapons, Caleb resorted to his final physical means of control, the boundaries of the land itself. He saw the impending closure of the Winter Shelf as his last chance to demonstrate that the deed, the legal and historical record of ownership, superseded the ephemeral spirit of a horse. Starving out the small rancher's stock before Christmas would be the ultimate proof that only Ironcrest's calculated resources could guarantee survival in the Bitterroot. The news reached the crossroads like a blast of freezing wind. The small rancher's herds were trapped high up. The snows were building fast, and if the cattle couldn't reach the lower pastures within 48 hours, they would surely perish. "It's deliberate starvation," Ben spat, his face etched with panic. "He knows we can't cross the main mountain face in this snow. The shelf is our only way down." The small community gathered again, but this time the inspiration of ash felt distant and intangible against the cold, hard reality of steel and timber. Caleb had found a way to weaponize the land itself. Dalton was there. He studied the crude map Ben spread out on the bar. The Winter Shelf was indeed the only viable route. Going around meant encroaching on federal land or facing impassable canyons. He looked at the anxious faces. Martha, whose old cows would perish first. Ben, who had mortgaged everything on his current herd. "We can't fight him on the legal papers," Dalton said quietly. "He has the old deed, but we can't let the stock freeze." They considered trying to dismantle the barricade under cover of darkness, but Caleb had posted guards, not Ironcrest hands but brutal anonymous hired muscle, armed and instructed to hold the line at all costs. They had been taught resilience by a horse, but how could resilience dismantle a fortress built of greed? The following morning dawned grey and heavy, the sky promising a deluge of snow. The temperature had plummeted. The collective herds of the ice-forged co-op, nearly 200 head of cattle plus some horses, were backed up near the entrance to the Winter Shelf, milling anxiously, instinctively sensing the encroaching doom. Caleb arrived at the barricade an hour before sunrise. He was bundled heavily, his face gaunt, his eyes holding a sickly, triumphantly cold light. He stood slightly apart from the hired guards, near a massive granite boulder, observing the suffering of the distant cattle through powerful binoculars. He felt a resurgence of the old power, the sense of absolute authority. Efficiency might have failed, but cruelty was still a reliable tool of control. He was the gatekeeper of life and death in the Bitterroot. He raised the binoculars again, searching the perimeter. He wanted to see Ben's frantic face, Martha's defeat. He wanted to hear the sound of the cattle giving up. Instead, he heard a sound that was too high, too resonant to be wind or snow. It was a faint, wild call, echoing off the high peaks of the Sentinel Gorge, coming from the direction opposite the trapped cattle. Caleb lowered the binoculars, turning toward the northeast, toward the truly wild country where Ash was known to roam. The sound intensified. It was not a single call, but a cascade, a thundering announcement of movement. Then they appeared. Ash led the vanguard. The Blizzard colt was no longer merely a sleek, magnificent stallion. He was the physical embodiment of the unclaimable Bitterroot. His coat seemed to absorb the dim light, making him a shifting shadow against the white snow. He moved with a focused, almost supernatural speed that defied the deep drifts. But Ash was not alone. Behind him streamed a vast, dark ribbon of wild life. There were 20 or 30 wild horses, their manes thick with ice, followed by a surprising number of elk and deer, all moving with an uncanny, disciplined purpose. And among them ran the Herefords that had defected in the summer, now looking indistinguishable from the truly wild beasts, their domestic nature entirely scrubbed clean by freedom. Ash was leading them along the crest of the highest ridge, a path no rancher, not even Caleb, had ever known to exist. It was not mapped, not deeded, not even suitable for steady travel, yet they moved along it with perfect confidence. Caleb stared, dumbfounded. The barrier he had erected was entirely physical, but Ash was demonstrating a truth that surpassed physics. There was always another way, a wilder passage that defied man's laws. The procession was aimed, not at the barricade, but at a point several hundred yards above the winter shelf, a treacherous granite-strewn gap that dropped sharply toward the lower pastures. It was a passage believed to be impassable for large herds, requiring a dangerous vertical descent. Ash reached the gap first. He paused for a moment at the lip, looking down into the deep, snow-filled channel. He looked back, not toward Caleb and the barricade, but toward the trapped cattle waiting below the ridge, sensing their presence. Then the stallion began his descent. It was an impossible feat. He did not slip or stumble. He moved with a calculated, inherent knowledge of the granite, planting the ice-forged hoofprints deep into the snow and frozen earth. Each step was a declaration of mastery over the elements. The sound of his passage, the clatter of rock and the crunch of unnatural strength was the only noise. The wild horses followed, instinctively trusting the leader born of the blizzard. The elk and deer, following primal pathways, slipped down the same treacherous route. And then the former Ironcrest Herefords followed, demonstrating a terrifying, liberated agility their domestic counterparts had lost. Caleb watched, shaking violently, his breath misting in the frigid air. The passage was narrow, brutal, and utterly non-negotiable. It was the land's own route, reserved only for those capable of earning it, and through it, Ash was forging a literal, physical path to survival. The true moment of despair for Caleb came when he saw his own hired guards. They were staring up at the impossible descent, not with aggression, but with slack-jawed awe. They had been paid to defend a steel and timber barricade. They were utterly helpless against the laws of nature, being rewritten before their eyes. As Ash and the wild cohort reached the bottom of the gap and sprinted toward the open valley floor, the trapped co-op cattle below the ridge began to respond. They didn't see the wild stock. They smelled the clear, open air of the descent and felt the massive magnetic pull of the wild passage. They pressed against the barricade, bawling, but the barrier held firm. Ash stopped at the very edge of the lower fields. He turned his head and issued that deep, resonant challenge again, the sound that embodied the raw solitude of the Sentinel Gorge. It was a call to faith. Martha's herd, exhausted and desperate, suddenly surged. Instead of following the failed winter shelf, they began to move upward, toward the deadly gap, driven by an instinct more ancient than the rancher's whip. Ben, Dalton, and the small ranch hands, who had been watching from a distance, understood instantly. The path was deadly, but it was the only way. They rode forward, using their own horses to guide the trapped cattle toward the newly opened passage, urging them up the difficult slope. The passage was brutal, but because Ash had paved the way, not physically, but psychologically, establishing the possibility, the domestic herds followed. One by one, slipping, struggling, but driven by the urgency of life, the co-op cattle made the perilous descent into the lower pastures. Caleb watched until the last cow, a sickly, limping calf, scrambled through the gap and disappeared into the vast safety of the valley floor. He was standing alone at his formidable, useless barricade. The hired guards, shaken by the spectacle, quickly abandoned their posts, recognizing that they were guarding nothing. Caleb reached out and touched the cold, sharp wire of the barricade. It was solid. It was legally sanctioned. It was utterly meaningless. He had won the legal battle for the land, but lost the war for life itself. He raised his hand and let out a soundless, ragged breath. He looked down at his own feet, covered in fine, expensive leather boots, resting on ground that was now, irrevocably, under the spiritual protection of a creature he had tried to murder. He rode back to Ironcrest without looking back. The Bitterroot Valley survived that winter entirely because of the Ash Passage. The small co-op herds thrived in the sheltered lower pastures, and when spring arrived, the ice-forged co-op held its first successful independent auction. The money flowed directly to the people who worked the land, bypassing the systems Caleb had used to bleed them dry for decades. Caleb Thorne never left Ironcrest, but he became a relic. He had the land, the house, the money, but he had lost his domain. The Ironcrest brand, the distinctive CT, faded into obscurity. When a ranch hand quit, Caleb never replaced him. The infrastructure of his tyranny simply degraded, until the ranch was running on skeleton crew and inertia. Dalton found purpose not in managing the collapse of the old empire, but in constructing the new, sustainable life of the valley. He became the unofficial liaison for the co-op, respected not only for his pragmatism, but because he carried the unique knowledge of ash's origin. He knew the cost of control and the value of untamed resilience. Ash remained the invisible lawgiver of the Bitterroot. He never allowed himself to be seen often, maintaining the aura of myth, but his presence was constant. The ice-forged hoofprints were now revered. They were found near water sources, confirming equitable distribution. They appeared near the boundaries of the co-op pastures, suggesting protection. They were the signatures of freedom, pressed deep into the earth. The valley, once cold and cynical, had shifted its philosophical center. It was no longer a place where resources were hoarded and weakness was punished. It was a place where strength was measured by tenacity, and where the greatest survival story belonged to a creature born in the heart of the storm. Caleb spent his final years sitting by his vast window, watching the distant ridges. He was no longer looking for Ash out of malice, but perhaps out of a strange, begrudging comprehension. The Blizzard Colt, the product of his greatest cruelty, had not only defied him, but had fundamentally redeemed the valley. The tyranny was broken, not by revolution or violence, but by an impossible, untamable spirit born on a night of freezing darkness. The Bitterroot Valley had found its true master, the wild, unbranded freedom that defied all ledgers, all brands, and all laws dictated by the cold hearts of men. It was the new, permanent law of the land, eternal and wild, born of the ice and forever free. Smash that like and sub to the channel.